right. Well, welcome everybody. It's nice to see everybody here. My name is Guy Biner. I'm the Sullivan Chair of Irish History and the Director of the Irish Studies Programme. And it's great to see so much attendance for our first event of the year. When I say first event of 2025, first event of this term, when I say first event, I'd encourage everybody who's in this room as they walk out to pick up one of these. You'll see them on the counter around the corner, which are double-sided, and it shows the list of events we have this term, to which we've already added, I think, a couple more, so we've got a very packed term ahead of us. Many, many events, and we're fortunate to have such an event to kick us off today. I'll introduce one person, introduce the rest of the people, because it's a special panel for us, because the panel is centered around a project which Mike Cronin co-directed and co-authored a book. We're going to be celebrating a volume. And Mike will introduce us more about it, but I'll say a few words about Mike first. I'll introduce Mike and introduce the project. Mike Cronin is the academic director of Boston College Ireland, the university's centre in Dublin. In many ways, the centre in Europe, I'd say, even more. It's one of our most valuable centres, and we cooperate with it extensively. Not only Irish Studies, but the whole university. But not everybody knows, people know him in that capacity, but Mike is also a very well-known historian of Ireland. Now, when I first heard about Mike, I was doing my own studies, and a book came out about blue shirts. It's not people who wear, it's not a fashion statement. It's about a fascist movement in Ireland. Fascism has gone back into style nowadays, so maybe blue shirts might be back. You never know. In addition to that, Mike's written about many, many other topics. He's written a couple of popular history books which have made Irish history accessible to many people. He's written a history of St. Patrick's Day, and I mention that in particularly because for those who are intrigued by what's happening today, I encourage you to come back to university on the 17th of March, St. Patrick's Day, where Mike will be coming over and delivering a St. Patrick's Day lecture about St. Patrick's Day and soft power, how it's used in Irish diplomacy and in Irish culture. Mike's written a lot about and engaged a lot with issues of commemoration and the decade of centenaries in Ireland. We're fortunate to have a visiting scholar here, Caoimhe Nicovade, who's over there, who's a Burns scholar, will be talking later this year, and is a great historian of the Irish Revolutionary period, but that's been a major topic of study for 10 years in Ireland, and Mike was heavily involved in that. And in fact, his most recent book, it's too many books to mention, but I should mention Revolutionary Times, Ireland 1912 to 1923 was nominated for the non-fiction book of the year in Ireland. So involved in many levels, but he's particularly known as a historian of sports, or at least that's what I always think of Mike when I think about him. Often he's engaged in many other things. Many people in Ireland came to see that when he coordinated and directed the Athletic Association, the GAA Oral History Project, which is a remarkable project looking at Ireland's Gaelic sports and the history of it through oral history, and that resulted in a very interesting volume. He's also written more generally a history of sports in Ireland, looking at the various different sports in Ireland, and he's also written a very short introduction on sports, so he's a leading authority on sports in Ireland. And among the many books, and he's also written, of course, the Rutledge Handbook for Irish Studies, edited as a collaborative project. But what we're celebrating today is a book co-authored with Kevin here, who will tell you about. We've got three guests who's going to introduce to you, and I only got to see the book today for the first time, so I'll be here about it today. There's a few documents, I believe, on the table which you might want to inspect later, but it's a curious story, and it's not an Irish story. You might hear the word Irish here and there, but it's not an Irish story, it's a Boston story. So it's fascinating to have it here in Boston College, which takes us back a while back into history of sports and a very curious event. So Mike, please tell us about it.
Thank you, Guy. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah.
First of all, a few thank yous. Number one, I feel like an interloper, not to be in Irish Studies, because I am in Irish Studies, but in the fact that Guy has kindly allowed us to come and talk about a non-Irish project. So thank you very much. There is some Irish in the book, don't worry. I also want to thank Rachel and Maria for organising everything brilliant as they always do, so big thank you to them. We'll explain later, Kevin and I, this is our pandemic project, okay? This is what we spent 2 years at home doing. A big shout out and thank you to all the archivists and librarians in Boston and the Boston area. They were getting strange emails from a strange man in Dublin and a strange man in Switzerland and they responded and sent us stuff, and they were brilliant, and the book wouldn't have happened with them, so thank you. Just by way of introduction to my fellow guests, and thank you so much for they're all travelled to be here. First of all, in the middle, Amy Bass is the Chair of Social Science and Communication and a Professor of Sports Studies at Manhattanville College. She's a multiple award-winning author whose books include Not the Triumph but the Struggle, the 1968 Olympics and the Making of the Black Athlete, and most recently One Goal, a coach, a team and the game that brought a divided town together. Next to me is Brian Funk, who's in the History Department at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. He is a historian of modern Spain, and also the leading American historian of soccer in the US. His most recent book was From Football to Soccer, the Early History of the Musical Game in the United States. And the far end is my co-author. Kevin Tallec Marston is a researcher based at the International Centre for Sports Studies in Neuchâtel, so he does win the prize at Switzerland. He wins the prize for the furthest travel here. He teaches on the FIFA Masters course and at the University of Neuchâtel. He's focused widely on soccer history, including work on women's soccer in South Asia, youth soccer, and the early decades of the game in the United States. So what I'm going to do, I'm literally going to take 3 minutes to try and explain the whole book to you, and then we'll start the discussion. As Guy mentioned, there's some artifacts around, some images here, we'll get to them. So Kevin was working on the early years of soccer history in the US. He was supposed to write a chapter for a book, and because he was in Switzerland, I'm back and forth. I said, look, if you need any archive stuff, I'll run in, I'll have a look. And I realised very quickly, and then the pandemic happened, that Kevin didn't have material for a chapter. He had material for about 3 books. So he started working and delving into it. Essentially, to try and tell this story very quickly, in a minute you'll see a picture of a plaque, or a monument, that's the one, on Boston Common. I don't know how many of you walking past Boston Common have ever registered with it. It's a monument to a football club, and I use that word advisedly, called the Oneidas, who played their football on Boston Common between 1862 and 1865, so right in the middle of the Civil War. They were a bunch of Boston schoolboys, and they enjoyed their games. And then these men, as you can see, elderly men, came together in the 1920s and started reminiscing about their youth, about their life. And they put up this monument to themselves. It's the only monument on Boston Common erected, organised and paid for by a living person for themselves. Why were they able to do that? One thing to know about these men is the school they went to in the 1860s, an institution called Dixwell's, trained young men of Boston for entry into Harvard. So from the get-go, they are a social elite. The monument they erect in 1925 says that they were the first organised football team in the United States. Interestingly, when the monument comes around, you'll see at the top of it there's a ball. It's actually an American football, it's a pigskin. So they're claiming in the 1920s, when American football was this huge popular collegiate game, is dominating the kind of social media imagination, and they're claiming that that's what they invented. Now, because they're a social elite, they're sitting on the boards of Harvard, the Massachusetts Historical Society, Society for the Preservation of New England Heritage, all these different bodies, and they discover the ball they played with when they were young men. I don't know about you, I don't have the football I played with when I was a kid. But they have it, 60 years old, they have this ball, and they present it to the museum. See the picture in a minute. They also present their history to the Massachusetts Historical Society, where one of them sits on the managing committee. They present a poem they've written to Harvard libraries. At no point does anybody challenge what they're doing, because they are the elite, and archivists and librarians take their material in. And what Kevin and I argue is that for very kind of clear political cultural reasons, they are flexing their power. Their power to say they invented this game that's become the mainstream sport in the US, which, as it were, invalidates the claim of the arch nemesis, namely Yale and Walter Camp. They're claiming that football is a Boston game. What they're also doing is around the time where Boston has undergone profound changes. If you think about Boston coming in 1863, it ends with water. Okay? So filling in of the Back Bay takes place during their lifetime. And they're the kinds of people who are investing in the Back Bay. They're living in the Back Bay. They're sitting on the boards of the cultural institutions that go move into the Back Bay. Okay? So what they're doing in their lifetime is their class, their elite class, is giving up political power in Boston to the Irish, and they're taking cultural and civic power. And part of that process in their dotage is to claim that they invented or organised football in the United States. Okay? That's the brief story. One little amendment. You'll notice that the ball they put into the museum, which is a black-coloured ball with some writing on it, is round. The football they choose to put on the monument is oval. 1994, they're long dead. Somebody is walking across the common, 1994, FIFA World Cup in the US, and they read it and they say, oh, first football club. And in the Anglophone world, football is soccer, football. So this person rings up Boston City Hall and said, hey, that monument's a football. World Cup's here, it'd be great for people to see it. It's a bit dirty, can we clean it? Sure, you're going to do the job for free? Great, knock yourself out. What they actually do is they have the monument cleaned and they have the ball re-chiseled so it's a round soccer ball. It takes somebody till 2014 to notice the change. It was a 3-year battle, and finally in 2017 the monument is now beautifully restored to being a pigskin. So this idea of this football, are we talking American football, are we talking soccer, and all these complexities around memory, around heritage, around kind of memorial history, commemorative history, how does that function on the page, in stone form, etc. And that's really what the book delves into. As I say to a lot of people, if you don't like sport, it's not a book about sport, it's a book about how history works. So, to move on. Kevin, I mentioned there the idea that we brought up a question whether these old men had perpetrated a hoax. We did want hoax in the title, the press wouldn't allow us, but that might be I'm not sure. What do you think of that question, whether these old men were perpetrating a hoax? And what, in a way, does that tell us about history and memory?
Thanks, Mike. So, hello everyone, thank you so much for being here. What does it tell us about history and memory, and what does it tell us about perhaps the wider sense of humanity? And that's what's interesting in this book and this story is very much how we understand ourselves. So we understand ourselves by telling stories in many ways. And this book is very much telling a story of a certain group of people, a certain identity of these Boston Brahmin, as many of you will know that term. And so the question we asked ourselves, as Mike said, is was this a hoax? And there was a part, I would say there's a part of this book we'll let you figure out for yourself. But there's a part of us that really thinks that there is a question of evolving intent, I would say. In order to commit a hoax is really a deliberate, right, intent to deceive or at least divert someone's attention from something and say something that's not entirely true, right? And so the entire story here is very much about the evolving intent of this group of people in order to head towards something which is not entirely true. And as you will kind of see perhaps later on, you'll have a chance to float around the table. There are a number of archival documents, pieces that we'll be able to talk through. But all of this really touches on the question of invented tradition, if many of you probably will be familiar with that word, the question of sites of memory and what the difference is between heritage and history. And so you have a group of men here that we saw before who at a certain point in their lives are remembering their past. They're looking back, very nostalgic, waxing about their Boston, right? And at a certain point, the world around them has changed. And so they begin from memory, and so they collect and they preserve, and they put in all of these institutions that Mike has mentioned. And then there's a certain shift when intent becomes a little bit more difficult, and some of the mystery behind the story is very much revealed in the private correspondence in the archives, in the material that is hidden behind a wonderful, ostentatious monument that's on the most important public space in the city, right, which is telling a story. And yet their private story is slightly different. And I think that's where it reveals a bit of the ambiguity of what's going on here, where they know that they've done something slightly mischievous. So I think that's kind of where at one point we named one section "Boys Will Be Boys" to really just highlight the mischievousness there. But really, ultimately, the story in terms of talking to us about myths and origins is very different. I mean, for those of you who know basketball was very simple to understand. It was created by someone. We know exactly when, where, and how. Football and many other sports or other cultural phenomena are not necessarily as clearly identifiable in terms of their origin point. And so part of the story here is to understand and elaborate how that process happens. And here, that process is essentially hijacked by a small group of people to tell their own story. So.
And just to add to that, by way of an explainer, I said about the monument. The monument, they put their teammates' names on the back of it. 15 people. Okay. A year later, they produced their own TypeScript history, which they sent to the Massachusetts Historical Society. Suddenly, there's 52 names, and they're literally an A to Z, a who's who of the richest, most powerful, wealthy people Boston produced during that era. So, for example, Roger Wolcott, the politician, is retrospectively claimed. He's dead by that point. But he's retrospectively claimed as one of their teammates. Great, I thought, amazing politician who played football at school. Pull up Roger Wolcott's autobiography. At school, I hated sport. So are they, again, posthumously adding names to make what their claim is, again, mischievously bigger because it's packed full of millionaires, business people, philanthropists, politicians. But so obviously, just moving on to Amy. Obviously, it's a fairly simple monument. It's a 1920s sort of memorial process. But obviously, we get 100 years forward. Sport is a multi-billion-dollar global business. What lessons are there for sport today in terms of how they think about their historical memory? Is it important? Is it a selling point? Does it mean anything?
Yes. Simply
Great
put.
answer.
Here you go, Brian. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for having me. I think that, I think about the role that baseball plays in the American context, the national pastime, which it no longer is, right? It just isn't. If you're talking about youth sport, it's soccer. If you're talking about the sport that makes the most money and has the most viewership, it's American football. But baseball clings on to this idea. And it has played with that idea in so many different ways, whether it's sort of negating the myth of someone like Abner Doubleday, right, which when you walk into Cooperstown, there's the ball and him, and then there's a small placard that says, by the way, none of this is true, and that this isn't how it happened, and yet the whole exhibit is still based on this myth of Abner Doubleday. But I think that the way leagues perceive themselves and the way they're put the money behind it, you're talking about people who want to be able to tell their own story, but really it's about the people who have the power, right, to get their story out there and to get people to listen to it. So I think you just reminded me several years ago, Chris Rock did a monologue about baseball and America because baseball was immersed in this new campaign of the good old days and nostalgia and the old-time ballpark, and they were going to wear their old-fashioned uniforms and have these days taking us back to the golden ages of baseball. And Chris Rock was like, there's a lot of us who don't want to think about the good old days in America because that's plantation America, right? And one of the things, and you can his monologue is still out there, you can watch it, and he does it far better and far funnier than I would. But one of the things that he was talking about is this tension of baseball losing its audience as baseball was trying to tell us who its audience was supposed to be. And those two things were at odds with each other, and what was being perceived as the whitening of the game from the very top all the way through the ranks of the players. So I think that we're constantly talking about how sports are reshaping themselves in terms of commerce, in terms of corruption, in terms of industry, in terms of global reach. And the NFL is is the poster child right now about how to spread a game and how to do that. It's an entertainment industry, it's not a sports industry anymore. But these narratives are crafted very carefully, and some narratives work better than others. And again, football not that long ago had a player die on the field in front of all of us, and then recrafted itself through a love story of Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce, right? It re-scripted itself as a love story. Don't think about DeVar Hamlin dying in front of our very eyes and then coming back. This isn't the bad sport anymore. So I think that, again, it's who has the power to tell the story and who has the power to make it stick. And when looking at a story like Inventing the Boston Game, I think that most of us would say, wait, a bunch of old rich white guys got their story out there? Shocking.
It's a good story though.
It is a very good story.
And on that word Amy used, Brian, reshaping. I mean, when you as a soccer historian, a sports historian, when you look at that monument and you think about how the monument emerges in the 20s, but then is critically reshaped in the mid-1990s, and a soccer ball is put there. What does that tell us about the evolution of this particular monument and sports memory over the last 100 years?
Wow, just a small question. If I could though, I kind of wanted to go back to your idea about the hoax, if that's all right. I'm going to answer a different question than the one you asked, but I was thinking about this idea of, to again go on a tangent from New Testament studies, prophecy historicized, which is really just an excuse to get the Jesuit and Irishman mentioned here at Boston College. But a former Jesuit, I should say, John Dominic Crossan, had this idea that once Jesus died, they did not have a history, right? And so they looked to the Old Testament prophecies as a source of what had taken place in the New Testament. And that came to my mind. Maybe it's a bit of a reach, but it came to my mind when you were asking the question about the hoax. And I wondered to myself if there came a point at which the Oneidas believed that they were the first football club ever in the United States, but didn't have any real kind of evidence to back that up. And so in some ways tried to recreate a narrative that they believed to be true by in some ways changing and altering certain facts to fit their story, or doing things like adding things to the names to the monument to bolster their case. So that was kind of something that immediately came to my mind when you asked that question about the hoax. Now to answer your other question, yeah, it's an interesting, I'm trying to think about it. I was a historian of soccer, and so I was always kind of suspicious about the notion of the Oneidas being the first soccer club in the United States. But I guess it does illustrate sort of the relative popularities of the different football codes that emerge over the course of the 20th century in the United States. So by the 1920s, soccer is at one of its most popular periods, actually, in the history of the United States. There's a full professional league in the 1920s called the American Soccer League, but it's a kind of a niche sport, and it can't compare to the popularity of intercollegiate football. Professional football was probably even smaller than professional soccer at this point in the 1920s. So I think in some ways perhaps they wanted to hitch their wagon to what was perceived as the more popular form of football. And then, as you said, at various points, or you talk about at various points in the book, for much of the 20th century, soccer is an afterthought for much of the country, and certainly professional soccer for sure. But it does have its moments in the 1970s with Pele and the NASL, and then in the 1990s with the World Cup and the launching of MLS. And so it does kind of come up, maybe bubbling to the cultural surface at various times. And I think at that particular moment, there was perhaps an opportunity, or somebody saw an opportunity to reshape this memory of the Oneidas. And that, as you guys trace in the book, had been going on within the literature, the historiography of soccer in the US during the course of the 20th century. But that literature is fairly small, or was, and still is really fairly small. And so I think it took a particular moment and maybe a particular neglect of the Oneidas and their monument, and the the people who did that to the monument took advantage of that opportunity, I think, to try and reshape the memory of the club and the team and the history of the sport.
It's interesting that the first, obviously the World Cup, FIFA World Cup comes here in 2026. I think it's the first LinkedIn post that the Boston organising committee put out was a picture of the monument saying football was invented in the city. It's like, no. I'm sure you'll see like the imagery of it a lot during the Boston period. So Amy, obviously one of the questions here again is that this, to the point at the end of your previous question about, rich white guys made these monuments for themselves, but they are doing it in a context of rapidly changing during their lifetime. They've emerged from as teenage boys from the Civil War through to the Gilded Age, Reconstruction, and so on. What about the frontiers of identity and the question around Americanness in the early to mid 20th century? And how does sport in a way speak to, or the kind of sport that's being created here, speak to wider issues around the multiple competing identities?
Yeah, well, I think Boston is a particularly interesting space in which to tackle those kinds of questions, because Boston is the center of a regional sports fandom, right? So with the exception of my beloved Red Sox, who actually bear the name Boston, and the Bruins, the New England Patriots, the New England Revolution, and so on. It's, Boston is something that represents a pretty big chunk, all of New England and half of Connecticut. And there is actually a dividing line in Connecticut where that identity ends and the New York identity begins in terms of this fandom. But that's for another book and another story. I think that one of the most interesting things about the idea of a monument is that it takes up space, right? It takes up physical space for this identity to exist. And sport has these spaces, not just in terms of the places where we play, the stadiums themselves, the arenas themselves, and the identity of those spaces have changed enormously in the last, within post-industrial capitalism, where, you now have Smoothie King Arena as opposed to Shea Stadium or what have you, places that were named for members of the community and now are these corporate behemoths. So the role of the physical space of play in a neighborhood has changed enormously, particularly because it has probably priced most of us out of making it a daily ritual. But it also serves as a reminder of who a fandom is and how they remember themselves. And if you think about the various things scattered, Camden Yards, meet me in front of the statue of Babe. There's a statue at Wembley. Is it Fowler? England fans. Where do you want to meet up? So I think that having these kinds of markers allows fandom to locate itself, whether it's based on something ridiculous. If it's the ethereal curse of the Bambino that surrounds Fenway and Tessie and the whole 9 yards that goes with that. The goats of Wrigley Field. I mean, these things exist in all sports fandoms. So I think that the interesting piece of the fact that they needed a headstone, for lack of a better way of describing it, was because they needed a physical marker that claimed space for the Oneidas who don't have a stadium and don't have a uniform and don't have a team.
And Brian, those kind of markers that Amy's just talking about, when you go back, you mentioned it briefly, when you go back to that early 20th century period when the men are kind of organised as a monument, they clearly tag themselves to the collegiate game, which is to do with their class, it's to do with their environs, as it were. It's clearly, they're claiming football, they're not claiming soccer. But as you just said, in the 1920s, soccer is the fastest growing professional sport, and certainly popular in the kind of northeastern region. Is that to do, again, how far is that to do with class, to do with the history of immigration to the area, that soccer goes one way and these men cling to football as the American game?
Yeah, it's a good question. Soccer has always been, I think, seen for much of its history in the United States, which is quite long, beginning probably in the 1880s. As an immigrant game, even though people were playing American-born, people were certainly playing it, especially in cities like St. Louis. A lot of Irish, again, mentioned. In St. Louis, mostly native-born, second-generation Irish immigrants and the parish system there. So There have been pockets where soccer was seen as was an American game, but primarily it was seen, and certainly the preponderance of the players have always been immigrants from Scotland and England, as well as other countries as well. And college soccer is not really too much of a organized, or it certainly can't compare to intercollegiate football on college campuses until much, much later in the 20th century. So there wasn't really the equivalent of a Harvard. I mean, there was a Harvard soccer team, but it was not nearly as important, I guess, as the intercollegiate team. So I don't know if it's. I mean, I guess it is sort of based in a class as well, because a lot of the soccer players were factory workers, just like in England, especially in North England. A lot of people came from Scotland, from places like Lancashire, to places like Fall River and Pawtucket and New York, and they brought soccer with them, and they played soccer, and they worked in the mills, and they did get some level of support, perhaps from overseers and mill managers who also came from those same locations. But I would say definitely that soccer was not, at least not in the Northeast, seen as an upper class game or a game for the extremely wealthy, which is ironic because it's sort of flipped now in contemporary times, where soccer is really seen as a middle and upper class sport.
Can I add something to that? There's an accessibility about soccer, though. The beautiful game, there's a global accessibility to it that I think is really important to its story. Whereas football, which is the most expensive sport to field within an intercollegiate space, soccer can be played anywhere by anyone. So I think actually an interesting comparison there would be the urban growth of basketball in this same time period. You just need a space where you can bounce something and put up a net. I think about the kids that I write about in One Goal who played soccer in the refugee camps in Africa, because they were able to wad together stuff to make a ball, and they needed no other equipment. A mark in the sand. So I do think that the accessibility of soccer, so yes, youth soccer in America, pay to play, it absolutely has this middle and upper class sensibility about the pipeline, but soccer is being played in so many spaces globally, right? The street game, the river game, all of these forms of soccer that I think put it in a class by itself in terms of us seeing who plays the game.
I think, on that basis of that image of the refugees you studied just playing their game of football, I want to go back to kind of an identity question and ask Kevin. Obviously, if you walked across Boston Common now, if you walked through Boston Common in 1863, a bunch of teenage boys roaring around after a ball is unremarkable. So an alien hasn't landed, it's a bunch of teenage boys kicking a ball. So their act of whatever they're doing, whatever game they're playing, is not of itself remarkable. On the table but the only news report of one of their games in 1863 is about 3 lines long, completely swamped by news of the Civil War. So we know the game happened, but it's the Civil War. Just kind of on that basis of where they narrate their story through the 1920s, where they tie it to the upper class collegiate game of football, the American game of football. Can you just explain, Kevin, in terms of that Civil War context, how these boys relate to one of their members that dies, other people who die in their families, and how they are embracing not just the class they belong to, but also that national story of the Union victory in the Civil War?
Yeah, thank you, Mike. The dynamic that plays out in the way they commemorate themselves in the 1920s is inseparable in many ways from their own genealogical history, their own family history going back through the 19th centuries and the Civil War. So these boys, as you've explained, are growing up in a world that's divided, completely divided, probably more so than today. Let's hope that it's more so than today. And in the context in which that is happening, the context in which that's happening is they're in school, they're young enough to not be involved in the war. So I think that's a key thing to think about. The distinction between the North and the South during the Civil War, they had different ages at which young men, boys, could be conscripted. In the North, it was higher than in the South. And so these boys are all young enough to be protected, quote unquote, Even if they hadn't been, their families were certainly well off enough to pay the commutation fee to pay someone else to go in their place. That said, they do have a completely intimate link to the war. Some of them have older brothers who immediately volunteer, go off, serve, fight, die. Some of them, their fathers are medical doctors that lose a nephew in the war. And it transforms their entire world to the point that when they come out of this period of the 1860s, they have lived through the entire disruption of their entire society. They go through Reconstruction and they build, and they are, again, the families of the Gilded Age. So they have reconstructed the entire world around which they're operating, which is then being transformed through immigration. We talked about, we'll plug the Irish because this is the Irish studies thing, but the Irish transformed Boston in so many ways, politically, etc. And so the question of how they then commemorate themselves, they are going back in this way to sort of, I would almost say, a pastoral idea of what their youth and their families were. And their families are really key in this because many of them are old Massachusetts families, old Boston families. So a number of them, they're all sons and daughters of the Revolution. They are not just linked to the Civil War, but they're linked to, the Revolutionary War and independence. So they have family lineages that go all the way back, and they publish their family histories in multiple volumes that are all donated, again, surprise, surprise, to the Massachusetts Historical Society, to the Bostonian Society, which they founded, right? Fascinating. But they're obviously preserving their own history and their own heritage, and that genealogical link is absolutely inseparable from the idea of the construction of a national identity, which builds through the turn of the 20th century. And I mean, you touched on this a little bit, Amy, as well. But when we get to the point of the 1920s, you have to remember something. 1924, we have an immigration change, immigration law, and this is something that was long coming, in the prior 20 years. But we close the door. The United States closes the door to mass immigration. Full stop. There's a quota system, and basically the waves and waves of Emma Lazarus's, poor coming in through New York and Ellis Island ceases. And at this point, this is a moment of transformation up here in terms of the identity. And this is where the United States, driven through Boston and New England, is rewriting its own national story. You have around this a tercentenary event of the Plymouth Landing. You have the founding of Boston, which is coming as an anniversary. All of these things are reshaping, in many respects, the identity which we have today, but was not necessarily articulated or manifested in the same way. And so, particularly, we talked about this at the seminar today at lunch, but the idea of, this common idea today, American exceptionalism, which is this phrase that everyone knows about, didn't exist at this point. This is when it was born, right? For those of you who know, what's the nickname of Boston, right? It's a city upon a hill, right? A city upon a hill. Fascinating. Where does it come from? It comes from the Arbella sermon, right? The one from the 17th century, which was forgotten. Everyone, maybe forgot all about this. And then it's resurrected in 1930 by a scholar at Harvard named Perry Miller, who gives new national significance to the meaning of the country, the meaning of its founding. And and all of that is linked to the story of these boys, because they are the ones in the city upon the hill. So one of the things that we talk about in the book is how, in a sense, and maybe I'll close here with that, is these 6 men, there's one missing in this picture, but the 6 men, see their place in the city upon the hill as a shining club upon the hill. So I'm going to turn it back over to you.
And just to add that one part of the book, plug in the book here. What we did again, the sort of the COVID-free time, we actually traced where every single one of these men lived, every single one of the elite Boston clubs they belonged to, the Athenaeum, etc., etc. So we really did construct these. They're not just rich; they are so hardwired into the structures of Boston's history. So Archbishop Lawrence, for example, is one of the United Boys. He speaks to the unveiling of one of the monuments. Just to move on, Brian, name me a question to both of you. Sport obviously has been, still is, a story of community, human relations, and the complexity of those things. And it's something we did try and tease out in the later chapters of the book. So, to put you on the spot, what does Inventing the Boston Game, our book, add to our understanding, and how does this link to Amy, to your work in One Goal, and Brian, I know your soon-to-be-released book on soccer and community?
Do you want me to say I mean, I think it's interesting because one of my personal takeaways that I hope is also a takeaway of the story of One Goal, which is about the quest for a high school state championship by a starting 11 in which 10 of the 11 members of that roster are African refugees in a small Maine textile town. And I think that community is work, right? Community doesn't just happen. Community is work. Community is the efforts of those who put the effort in to build a community, to represent a community, to make a community function. And so we can talk about the power politics of that, which I think you explore so beautifully with the background of each of these men, who they are and why they're able to create a narrative that they've decided, right, as a narrative of the community. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. There's a moment in One Goal when they're getting ready for the state championship game when a friend of the longtime assistant coach says that's not what a Maine team looks like. And the coach is speechless and he walks away, and he's talking about the fact that this is a group of Black kids representing a Maine town. And for me, there's a difference between those who have to exert power and influence to be the story of a community, and those who do it via performance. Right? These 11 kids got to tell the story of that community because they won a gigantic trophy for the first time ever in city history. I think about that when we look at sort of the defining moments of sport across the 20th and 21st century. Jesse Owens was, who we've had lots of myths about, right? The prevailing mythologies of Jesse Owens and Aryan supremacy and Hitler and the snub that wasn't a snub. But his was a performance, right? 4 gold medals. And that's a performance that got to be a defining narrative. Whereas you flash forward to 1968, my work on Tommy Smith and John Carlos, that wasn't just a performance, and it was a hell of a performance, the first human to run a sub-20 in the 200 meters. But it was a political action, right? To take up the space of a narrative and to own it for a moment. So I think that one of the things that we always have to decide in terms of what the story of a community is how it's being scripted. Is it being scripted because of who you are? Is it being scripted because of what you're doing? Is it being scripted because of the space that you're taking up, the space that's being taken away? Are you part of a very loud fringe? Are you part of a quiet majority? I think those are the things that are always at work here, and I think that your book really sort of follows that ebb and flow beautifully, and it is always an ebb and flow. It's always 2 steps forward and 3 back and 5 forward. And I think even with the very game that was being claimed, right, across your book, I mean, I kept being like, all right, it's definitely rugby. Oh, no, wait, it's football. No, it's soccer, right? And I still don't know what it was, and I'm okay with that by the end of the book. But you sort of thought, well, I'm definitely going to know by the end of the book. And you don't, and that's okay. It's okay to not know everything. I don't know that they knew. Right? I don't know that they knew, but I think that all of those things have to be considered when you're looking at community and the battle for narrative and identity.
Well, my work is primarily in the late 19th and really late 19th and up to the World War I, the 19-teens up to about 1920. And during that period, unlike today, soccer clubs were quite literally clubs of non-professionals for the most part who maybe they worked together. They lived in the same neighborhood. There are exceptions to this, of course, but so they played soccer, they had banquets, they drank together, they lived near each other oftentimes. So they did build a sense of community and a sense of intimacy, I guess, with sport at its center. And I think that's a very different way of thinking about it, today, especially because professional sport has become such a big thing. And I think when people tend to think about sports, that's what they think of, and not these kind of small, community-based clubs or teams. I was talking to some of my students and I said, does something like that exist today? And one of my students said maybe pickleball, I guess, does today, where her dad was really into pickleball and has his pickleball friends and they play pickleball and do other stuff, I guess. So maybe it does exist in pockets. And I think one of the things that I really liked about the book is just how important, there's all this stuff, the top level stuff about were they the first club, they're pushing this particular narrative at various points. But from the correspondence that you cite and from the connections that they had really their entire lives, it shows how important being a part of that club was to them. And even before it became so important to be, the first, you write about the book that was written in or published in 1906, I think. And that was just like hey, let's reminisce about our past or something like that. And, one of the most touching elements was you said that they would, I forget who it was, but two of them would correspond with each other and they would say, dearest teammate or something, even when they were like 50 or 60 years old. And so this was an important and defining set of relationships that were forged through sport and through membership of this club. And I think, that's something that I've been talking about or writing about, and that's going to be in my new book, Beyond the Field, How Soccer Built Community in the United States, out in May.
Nice book.
Is just trying to talk about those connections. So it's not so much about winning and losing, it's not about scoring goals, it's about how they built these communities and these relationships really between each other. And so, yeah, I think that's one of the most, I thought was one of the most effective things about your book, gentlemen, was just that, the power that was in those relationships and how it persisted over time.
Can I just pick quickly up on that, Mike? The question of community, and I think that is really central to the story that we tried to tell here through the book. And maybe that's a nice segue as well, just to explain very quickly the artifacts and articles that you have behind you. So when we get to the end of this, feel free to circulate around the table from right to left. Okay, it goes in chronological order, and in a sense, it illustrates in many ways the sense of community. So it starts from portraits and documents that are from the 19th century that are contemporary to when they were playing their games. And in that, I would just like to thank Heidi Charles, who's all the way in the back, who is the librarian archivist from Noble and Greenhouse School, who has kindly brought some of these artifacts here tonight. And the exhibition here, we have wonderful support from the Massachusetts Historical Society, who has let us borrow a copy of the 1906 book, which is all about community of these boys in the 19th century. So feel free to have a look at that. And then as you work through, there are some newspaper elements and some of the commemorative documents that they've used. Again, this is from Revolutionary Spaces, so for those of you who have a chance to go into the old State House or the South Meeting House, they have kindly supplied those this evening. And then on the left side is where the story changes in the sense of community. They're all dead by this point in the late 20th century. And community, which is, we come back to soccer here, in the 1970s and 80s, when the story shifts and becomes a soccer story and no longer an American gridiron intercollegiate story. We have some documents there from the FIFA Museum that have kindly supported that as well. So some brochures that show how the story was taken in as a soccer community story to show Boston as the rich origins of soccer communities. So pass back to you, Mike.
Yeah. I mean, just again, Heidi brought in this beautiful portrait on the table of the team captain, a guy called Garrett Smith-Miller. And again, fast forward to when these men are in their 80s. Garrett Smith-Miller is most famous when you Google him or you go into the journals. He imported
Holstein cattle.
Holstein cattle into America. So he's the man who revolutionises the milk industry in this country. That's what he's known for, not football. But the point is, he's obviously in upstate New York. One of the other gentlemen who's involved in the monument in his 80s is in dire straits. He's not made a fortune. And it's a lovely thing in those letters that Brian touched on where they write about teammate. Garrett Smith-Miller will send from his farm boxes of produce to this guy in Boston just to keep him going. Pays his medical bills. And that's when they're kind of 82, 83, 84. This is genuinely a lifelong friendship. So, okay, I'm going to give all three of you one big question to think on and give your big answers to. So, sports history and the wider society. Obviously, one thing we've talked about here is an origin story. They're neither claiming they invented or were the first, which we could put alongside having a double day in the States with baseball. We can put against, in my hometown, William Webb-Ellis and the invention of rugby football. They clearly embrace, and there's other examples, mythical origin stories in sport. And in a way, in this current moment in the United States where origins are being rewritten on a daily basis, is this need for an origin myth something specific to sport, or is it part of a wider need in society for any and multiple forms of origin stories?
Okay, they're all looking at me. I mean, I think origin stories permeate so many facets of life, and you know, you can think about how we talk about our founding fathers, quote unquote, in the United States, and you know, this sort of myth of a unified creation of a country versus the actual. I dig the movie, the musical 1776, because they actually argue in that musical, and that's really how these things come to be, being diametrically opposed and arguing and figuring things out through that kind of confrontation. But I think that, you know, the Founding Fathers is an origin story which is massive. The melting pot of the United States as one of the, you know, most destructive origin stories, but one of the most prolific. Thanksgiving was mentioned earlier today. And I remember, you know, my daughter coming home from preschool with her pilgrim hat on and holding a construction paper Indian headdress, and you know, my PhD in history went right out the window because I was like, how cute are you? And you know, who knows better than I do, but it was adorable. And I didn't, you know, call the school and say this is blasphemy and it's not true and stop doing that. I think I probably would now at this point. So I think, you know, they're big and small, right? Like I was invited to do a writer's workshop a couple years ago in Bemidji, Minnesota, and on my itinerary it was like, you know, I had to go to Paul Bunyan's birthplace, and there he was. And you know, it wasn't a question of whether or not I believed in Paul Bunyan and his ox. So I think that origin stories, Babe, thank you. Is it Babe? He's blue. That's all I remember. He's blue and enormous. You know, origin stories can create grounding. They can create roots. They can explain things, right? Boston is such a great place to talk about this, and I wrote a chapter in Dan Nathan's wonderful book about rooting for the home team. About I said, you know, being a Red Sox fan is a faith-based occupation. Truly, you know, for how many years, over 80 years, we believe was the rallying call based on, you know, this mythical origin story of why they lost. Not an origin story of being the last team to desegregate and being the last team to actually bring on board a wide array of players from a wide array of places, but rather, you know, rooted in this myth of the curse of the Bambino. That's a story that was created, right, as an explanatory story for a massive losing streak. And it's not based in truth, and it's not based in the realities of how to build a winning team, which is still eluding us for some reason. So I think that no, it's not just sports. I think the very founding of this country shows that in the stories that we tell about it. But I always think that it's about providing answers and providing a belief system that makes you care about something beyond the score of the game. And sport would not be sport if all we cared about was the score of the game. And so that these are the pieces that mean you paint your face and take off your shirt in, you know, negative degree weather, Buffalo Bills fans, looking at you, and so on.
I agree. I mean, I think it's probably a human desire to have a story, to know your origins. I mean, think about the popularity of genealogical research. I was just reading a story about someone who, these periodically appear, where someone had been told a story, an origin story about their life and their family and their family's experience, and then they take a DNA test and they find out that that origin story is wrong or different, and just how upsetting and unnerving and disturbing the whole thing is for them. So I think people in their own lives like an origin story, and when that origin story changes, that can be upsetting. And I think too, sometimes as historians, I'm sure we've all encountered resistance to efforts to revise an existing narrative. Periodically people will be outraged about some new historical study that's been percolating through academic circles for years or decades, but suddenly reaches, a point of cultural awareness to the broader public, and there's always angry letters and calls, and why are you changing this history? And we just say, that's what we do, we're sorry.
We're not sorry.
Yeah, we're not really sorry. I always tell people that sometimes they don't like historians because we make things more complicated, and people don't like complicated all the time. I think sports too, especially modern sports, particularly, Alan Gutman, who's a famous scholar of the history of sports, has a whole list of the characteristics of modern sport, and some of them I think really lead to a need for origin stories. It includes like quantification, keeping score, all of that kinds of stuff leads to, we want to know where it began, where it ended, how we can measure this history. So I think sports maybe has an additional, modern sports at least, has kind of an additional impetus or desire for these types of origin stories, coming out of the way in which modern sports developed over time.
I like your question, Mike. It makes me think of Stephen Jay Gould. So for those of you who know Stephen Jay Gould, one of the most eminent evolutionary biologists, right? He's written about evolution. And he's also written about baseball origins and After a Doubleday. And he brings these two together very nicely. And I think what's most fascinating in this story in the book is we live in a post-Darwinian world. We live in a post-evolutionary world, which is very different than the world that, in some sense, these boys were born into. They grew up in the transformation of that, in a world that started to question creation myths, it started to question origins stories, and started to explain everything in a different trajectory sort of way. And so I think the sporting story at the heart here, which brings us, it allows us to, I suppose, better understand ourselves, because as you were saying, origin stories do give us a sense of direction, give us a sense of meaning. Now we choose, to a certain extent, this is where we exercise historical agency. We're choosing which story we're putting forward, how we're shaping that, or reshaping it, as in the case of this. And maybe in there, I will just make a mention that there's some of the documents that are there are, they're old, they're 100 years old, 1906 and 1920s. Some of those documents are manipulated truth. Some of that you see on the table are photoshopped 1920s version. Okay, so for those of you who know photographic history, there's a long tradition of people being erased in and out of photos, and photos being modified and manipulated. Some of the documents there are reveal that, and that's part of the mystery of the mischievousness of these old boys. But I think the sense of this story, which illustrates what we could call pseudo events. So pseudo events, which are the events that are simply created in a sense to make news and to make you know something about something else. That's different than history, the actual outflowing of events here. But to kind of come back to the last bit of your question, Mike, which is what's the significance here? The significance, I think, at the end really tells us, why do people do these things? Why? Really, why? Why would you build a monument? Why would you celebrate all of this? Yes, sure, it's to put your name in the history book. Obviously, that's undoubtable. We chronicle that. But there's a private revealing of intent in this book, which I won't necessarily give it away, but there is a sense of doing it for what you said, Mike, which is the human side, the community side, the relational side, the friendship side, the dearest teammate, a man that I will send fruit, vegetables, I'll pay your medical bills, even though I haven't seen you, and we'll write to each other, and we have this deep human bond, and that goes beyond anything that you could criticize in what's up here. And I think ultimately what I always come back to is the historian is not a judge. So I think it's key is from the historical perspective, we're not judging history and intent. We're trying to explain and understand and nuance and outline. But what the book really outlines, I suppose, is kind of universal human experience in many ways.
I quickly, can I just add? I think another tiny thing to put on the table is the fascination with being first at something, the fascination with discovering something, right? We know Columbus didn't discover anything. We still have Columbus Day. So this idea of being first, this idea of discovery, this idea of laying claim, and it's absolutely related to everything else that's going on within the United States in this moment, whether we're coming out of or blowing up Manifest Destiny and the idea of new territory and the idea of ownership. But I think that this idea of being first, I've been to 2 of the 3 synagogues that claim to be the oldest in the country. We have those warring narratives. And so I think that the weight of being first at something shouldn't be left off the table when thinking about these men and what they did, because they probably can lay claim to something. They had all of these attributes of being a team, of having regularly scheduled games, of competition, they did something that not a lot of people were doing. But they wanted to invent it.
I think that's actually, Amy, your point about Boston being full of those kind of origin stories. When we kind of worked through the book, Kevin and I, and you looked at these men and you understood them, you always went back to the question about why are they doing this? And I sometimes do wonder whether it's the cities pushing down on them in terms of the people they list as playing on their team, who were all dead by that point in the 1920s, had all achieved something in the city, in national politics, in national life, in global life in some cases. Whereas these last 6 survivors, maybe one of them was a professor of theology in Harvard, and was very instrumental in kind of modernising Harvard in the sort of early 1900s. He's probably the only one who would have got a biography and a picture in the Boston papers. But I'm wondering whether, because that pressure of Boston, in their 80s, they are sitting there thinking, what did I do significant in my life? And what they decided on with their community, they invented. Where's Guy gone? All right, do you wish to drive a question and answer session?
Yeah, you want to start and say
Do you want to share it?
No.
Continue? Okay. Thank you very much, everybody. Any questions? Anybody need some burning yes?
Yeah, I'm wondering if the development of the monument and the very focus on the elite, Brahmin inventors of the game, it can also be seen as a kind of representation of a suppression of the alternative culture or the Irish culture in Boston. In other words, the monument sort of suggests that these people are actually engaged in saying we are what really matters, and that's in effect the kind of role of the monument, and perhaps even the role of your book, to forget about all the people who are always forgotten, because the elites and the great and the good get to build the monument.
And just to add to that, maybe just another point, if it's the first football game, we hear about them, but it's a point you made earlier, they don't play against themselves, they play against another team. Why are they not being commemorated? It's an act of exclusion from the very beginning, right?
It was we know it was a combination of 3 different school sides. The United were by far the best. So 3 other schools had to join together into one team to try and beat them, and they didn't. The fascinating thing about motivating history, on the other side, on the other team, there were 2 men, John Malcolm Forbes, I forget the other one, both who become very significant Bostonian figures. The Uniteds claimed them as being part of their team, even though they were on the other team.
Yeah, no, absolutely. The interesting question of maybe suppressing other memories. Perhaps something that's worth noting is, this monument is erected in 1925. So this is in the midst, sort of at the end of a long wave of many monuments and plaques that were put up in Boston, all across the Common, the Public Garden, but across the city itself. I think you mentioned this, Mike, obviously, that the monument is the only one that is not a post-mortem exercise. So everything else that's put up is done in retrospect to honor someone who has died, right? This monument is the only one that is unveiled by the living who actually are honored on it, which is mind-blowing, and yet really interesting. And what we see is in this wave of monument construction, which I think Eric and Doss call statue mania, which is wonderful. It's a common theme across Western cities, you have a lot of monuments being built in the end of the 19th century, early 20th. And a number of them in Boston, you have different communities that are building their monuments, right? The Irish have monuments. Their first monument, I think, comes in earlier after the Civil War to honor the first Irish. I think his name is Thomas Cass, who was a general, not a general, but I can't remember what his status was in the North, but he was a soldier that was being honored to represent the Irish community, right? The Norwegians have a monument. You have a Columbus monument. You have all of these different communities building monuments over the course of that. And these men, who are not part of those communities, they are the Brahmin, right? So they are able to surf a wave of commemoration that is already honoring in many ways Boston. As you said, Mike, the Boston Brahmin by this point in the 1920s have retreated from the political space. They still own the economic and financial center. And what they can do now is to control the cultural capital and the development of cultural capital. And so they are doing that through monuments. But the monuments are also, in this sense, honoring the Norwegians, the Irish, etc. So that they're part of all of that. It's just another voice. And perhaps what's, maybe to end on that, is in 1924, so just a few months before the monument kicks off, there's an article in the literary magazine that's reproduced and then syndicated across the New York Times that talks about Yale football and Boston football and intercollegiate football, calling about, we need to have a monument and we need to have people to some of the great players of the day. So I think Ed Casey was one of there's a guy named Ed Casey, I believe, and then Ed Mahan. So two of the biggest stars of 1920s football in Boston, they're of Irish origin. So it's, the game that is being reappropriated by our old Oneida boys is actually being played out by now rising immigrant groups who are now going to Harvard and playing the game. So it's really interesting that in the call for that, they then say, well, yes, the guys who are actually playing and who are drawing 50,000 at Harvard Stadium, they are sons of the immigrants that we gave our city to, in a way. And so they're reclaiming a bit of their own identity in this story.
Yeah, I think an important point here too is that during the 19th century and probably even before, I think football, as we would call it today, not American football or soccer or rugby, but some kind of ball game was probably pretty ubiquitous almost everywhere. There was open space. And it really only rises to the level of media attention when there's a catastrophe, like someone is killed or something major happens that someone takes note of this activity that's taking place everywhere. When I was a kid, every recess we would play a game called Kill the Guy with the Ball, which was just running around and tackling each other and throwing the ball. And that was a type of football that has probably been played in this country, not in that exact game, but some similar kind of version for centuries. We can tell this because if you do a search in newspaper databases for football, almost all the hits that you find are referring to things like slavery is a political football. So everybody knows what a football is. Everybody's familiar with a football, but it rarely rises to the level of attention. And I think the Oneidas were perhaps some combination of lucky and privileged that their games, got the attention of the media. And then, of course, as the book lays out, they were able to then continue that remembrance and deposit that remembrance and create an archive of that game. Whereas, probably hundreds of thousands of millions of boys and girls played those types of games all around the country, but didn't have the luck or the privilege to be able to have it remembered or archived in some way.
Do you think they innovated the game in any way, or sports, or popular appreciation of sport?
Just to clarify, so the question is, did they innovate the game?
Mm-hmm.
Good question. Do you mean at the time they played or when they were commemorating it? Because there's an interesting...
I think I'm getting at holistically.
Sure.
In any way, do you think that they moved the needle in terms of sports and popular culture with sports?
Well, maybe I will answer the question with a question and say that on the table back there you have 2 newspaper articles, the only 2 newspaper articles that actually mention the team's games. There's only 2 in the newspaper record, and then there's the book that describes their game. If you want to have a look through it afterwards, there is no sense of what they were playing. We have no idea what they were doing. They do say in 1926 when they're commemorating, we had the greatest tactical formation, and they outline it in the back of this document that's then deposited at Massachusetts Historical Society. You can go and look at it. There's just a mention to it here. And so they say that they have reinvented this document right here, which is, it's also in the public domain. You can find it on the internet. The original copy, for those of you who like artifacts, is in Massachusetts Historical Society. But they claim that they've invented the game. They invented it tactically, and they made new positions, etc. I'll let you look at the evidence and make up your own mind.
I didn't get a chance to read the book yet, but the thing that did surprise me is I was, Googling around in anticipation of the lecture tonight is how come the ball ended up with Spinia? It seems like an odd organization to have it, as opposed to the Massachusetts Historical Association. And I'm wondering, 2 things occurred. One is, Otis House is vaguely on Beacon Hill, so it's not close. And the second one is that William Sumner Appleton was a very, very enthusiastic Harvard football. And I'm wondering, is there an interesting story there as to why, the football ends up with Spinia as opposed to an organization which would seem to be more, like Mass Historical, would seem to be more logical as we go there?
Well, I think my understanding of SPNEA, so for those of you, that's Society for the Preservation of New England Antiquities, which today is Historic New England, it's been rebranded for 20 years ago. When they were created in 1911 or so, around that, I can't remember the exact date, they had a deliberate mission to collect artifacts. Whereas the Massachusetts Historical Society, is a historical society, a library, etc. They do obviously have objects, some great objects on display now. I can send you over there. But the SPNEA, their mission really, and it's clear through the bulletins that they produced in the 1910s and 20s, they are calling out to the Boston Brahmin community, all of them, saying, please give us your objects, things that you think are worthless. We will take it all. And so many of the Boston Brahmin and the old the Oneida Club members, many of whom are actually members of the SPNEA, they're sitting on the board. They donate all sorts of things, not just the football. So they donate, classical colonial curtains. They donate wallpaper. The list of donated items every year is enormous. And so the football is just another one that is on the list. And so I think it goes there, particularly because of the mission of that cultural institution.
Is there sort of a territorial aspect to putting the monument up in Boston Common, sort of the 1920s, as different immigrant cultures move into the city, where they're saying sort of this used to be our playground, and sort of putting their cultural stamp on that sort of historical ground there?
I think, yeah, you're right. I mean, I think it definitely is on the side of where their old field is. We know from their descriptions exactly where they played. But I think what's interesting about the monument location in 1925, where it still is, speaks also to the changing social geography of Boston. So, as I say, the Common would have led into the Garden, which would have led into the Charles. That's now the Back Bay when they're around. And I think if you look at their book they published in 1906, Old Boston Boys and the Games We Play, they talk about all different kinds of games, but one of them is like snowball fights against Irish boys, the domination of the Common. And I think where the marker goes in 1925, where the monument goes, is an important delineation line almost where they used to play between the new wealthy areas of the Back Bay, Old Beacon Hill, where many of them came from originally when they were boys, versus that delineation somewhere, some invisible line across the Common, where everything, as we look to it to the right, is, okay, it's the business centre where those guys go to work, but it's actually the immigrant areas. And the Common, and Mark Peterson, the Boston historian, written about this idea that the Common is almost a fire break between rich and poor, between American and non-American. So I don't think the monument ends up exactly where it is in the Common by accident. Okay, We've kept you all long enough.
Well, before we thank all of you there, because it really was an interesting. I'll point out a few things that I can, if I make some quick observations. First of all, there was a lot of almost. You had to apologize. Is this a hoax or is it not a hoax? The question you began with. I'd like to reassure most people in this room. Most of history, which is a discipline which I dabble in, is hoaxes in this sense. Most of history is about people taking an event, because days are full of events, choosing this as an event which is significant, and building a story around it. Right? So in that sense, it's an historical event like any other, even if it's completely fictional. Right? And that's the first point we should note. Another point that I'll note here, in terms of memory, we saw here a great example of memory activism, a group of people deciding to commemorate something and building a whole apparatus and how it works. And this happens all the time. We're increasingly aware of it now in memory studies, how much memory generates from memory activism. Different groups taking initiative, often grassroots, to take events which are important for them and making sure that they're remembered. The point that I will point out to you, though, is we also saw an exercise in memory activism up there. Because, yes, this is the story of the memory of the beginning of football, and yet, how many people before we entered into this talk today knew this story? The story is a story about memory, but it's a story about forgetting. How many people have gone through Boston Common and not noticed that monument? Not stopped and read it? Right? Most of us didn't know about this story. So today we discovered the story, so the book itself is an act of memory. And we can scoff at memory, we can scoff at how it plays a role and it's full of deception, and yet it's done exactly with the sensibilities of our time. Nowadays we don't want a simple story, we want it to be complicated, we want to have this awareness of all these layers of memory. So with that, I think we've got an excellent exercise of our own sensibilities of how we deal with memory today. Specifically in an area like sport, which like was mentioned here, brings so much more than the game itself. It brings community, it brings value, it brings so much more to our lives, and excitement. That sport is a great example to see that. And with that, I really wanted to thank all of our panelists, Mike, Kevin, Amy, and Brian. It was highly entertaining, but also very educational. The story seems like an anecdote, and yet so much more can be gotten out of it. So thank you very much.
Thank you.